in colluding in advance of this talk, I also tried to look for a sort of point in time in London that if I had a time machine I could go back to and be inspired by. And I thought about making it last Saturday at the Arsenal and Tottenham match, but I thought I wasn't really taking full advantage of that tool. So instead, I would love to share with you some thoughts about why the Great Exhibition in London was absolutely a changing point in our history, and why the optimism that that exhibition created is something that I think we feel today in the moment living in London. So, Great Exhibition launched on May the 1st, 1851. The idea was just to bring together human ingenuity under one roof. An unbelievably ambitious challenge, incredibly difficult to do. This was the sort of crescendo of the Industrial Revolution, where we created tools that actually had never been imagined before. It was launched, and many of you would have heard of the place Crystal Palace. It was actually launched in a Crystal Palace, which has subsequently named that area of London, but it was opened in Hyde Park. It was a huge structure, so it sort of reminds me of this building. It was interesting to look up this morning. It was 30 meters high. They built it around oak trees in Hyde Park. It was the size of 15 football pitches. In total, there were 100,000 exhibits in the building. An unbelievable thing to experience. And it was actually Prince Albert, so Queen Victoria's husband, who was the driving force behind it. When they unveiled it on May the 1st, everyone walked into a 600-person choir. Can you imagine and they sang Hallelujah. It was a big, big moment in London's history. Unbelievably inspiring to see these 100,000 exhibits from 32 different countries. And I'd love to share some of the characteristics of that moment that I think we should be feeling here today. And I think you'll hear examples that perhaps you'll be able to relate to through the course of today. The actual environment must have been unbelievable. There were tools in there, for example, a sort of steam hammer that could forge a bearing of a giant ship, but similarly could just gently crack an egg. Can you imagine that in 1851? There were dentures that would swivel so that when you sneezed, they didn't fall out. There's some unbelievably important stuff. There was an alarm bed. There was a bed where you would set the time, and at a specific time it would just throw you out of bed, which is something that I think a few of our speakers needed this morning, given our tardiness. And then, it wasn't just physical devices. One of the things I love about this is it was eclectic. It was celebrating all human ingenuity. So there was beautiful art there. In the interest of sort of propagating stereotypes, I thought I'd mention the French sent some absolutely wonderful art. And they also sent some nude sculptures that the local bishops quickly draped stuff over to hide their embarrassment. So I think Charlotte Bronte actually described after the event how she felt, and I think this sums it up really wonderfully. Its grandeur does not consist of one thing, but in the unique assemblage of all things. Whatever human industry has created, you find there. It seems as if only magic could have gathered this mass of wealth from all the ends of the earth. It must have been, you can just imagine the goosebumps as you went in, and Queen Victoria went back 6 times with her kids. People were revisiting. So there are 3 things, so similar to Rohan, I wanted to identify 3 things, and I think these 3 things are true today as well, and our job is to celebrate them. And the first thing that I think made the Great Exhibition different from anything that had happened before, probably in human history, was the diversity. So 32 countries worth of exhibits were in there. By the end, so it lasted 5.5 months or so, I think it finished in October the 10th. And by the end of that process, a third or a quarter of the UK population had visited. They'd visited and they'd had their minds blown. They would never have been able to imagine. There were swathes of school kids going through each day, inspired, seeing this ingenuity that they couldn't have even imagined. I think I read a lovely example when preparing for this where some Kentish were coming from the sort of southwest of the UK, and their vicar equivalent sort of brought them in. And the local Londoners said at the time, these people are more foreign to us than the foreigners in London. It brought together swathes of society that we would never have been able to imagine. And they were inspired by physical stuff. So for example, this, which was by George Pocock, it's called a char-volant. It's basically a kite-powered carriage. So there was ingenuity from domestic ingenuity, if you like, but there was also incredible stuff from abroad. Can you imagine going for the first time and seeing an elephant howdah that was donated by a Raj in India, just to experience the diversity of culture? So the first point I wanted to make is this diversity is a kernel, is a seed, a petri dish that creates subsequently. And when I say creativity, I'm not just talking about the arts, I'm also talking about mechanical engineering, I'm also talking about architecture, building, how we structure stuff, this type of space. And we have that diversity in London like never before. So this is a map you can't see brilliantly because of the resolution, but this was a map that was recently built, and it actually analysed the languages spoken on Twitter in London over the Olympics. And they found 66 languages regularly spoken in London. Each language is a different colour spot that you can see up there. They just basically gathered the tweets, used Google Translate, used the GPS and placed them. There's a huge option value in this diversity. So one of the potential valuable parts, one of the benefits of having this diversity, I experienced firsthand. So we built a site called OpenIDEO where people come together globally to solve challenges for social good. So we have 41,000 users at the moment from 160 countries. We base it out of London because we couldn't be closer to all of those different countries anywhere else. When I walk out my front door, I consistently see different cultures, different use cases I would never have imagined. I would never have thought, in Middle Eastern or Islamic culture that perhaps there was absolutely no bloody need for a hands-free. There's far more creative solutions. It benefits us to be exposed to these different cultures. And then I look at the diversity. So this is a sort of mapping of my LinkedIn profile. And I like the fact that on the blue, you've got a sort of Harvard network on the far left, and then IDEO is on the far right as a sort of creative network. But it's the blend of these two networks that I think holds value. And you could plot something similar for London's population. This diversity, I think, will act as a sort of fuel for creativity ongoing. So to give you an example of that, we recently ran an event which we deliberately didn't call a hackathon, because my perspective is hackathons sort of sound like they're only inclusive to hackers. We called it a makeathon, and we invited everyone, entrepreneurs, designers, hackers. We sat people, that diverse group that we'd assembled really quickly in a room for 36 hours. They designed an app for Amnesty International, which is currently being tested in Kenya, to help those at risk of unlawful detention. One team decided to tackle cycle safety after they had first-hand experience, and they came up with this idea. It's an Arduino circuit board, and basically it's proximity sensing. So if you get too close to the back of the bike, you get this frowny face and it chirps. But this stuff was built in 36 hours because we harnessed that diversity, that creativity in London. And even in my personal investing, I see this. So the other benefit is we're attracting the world's talent. I would expect Level 39, I would expect Rohan's business model competition to attract talent globally so that we set the bar high in London. So an example is my investment. I have roughly 18 investments. If you take away the ones that are in London, the ones that are not in London, the US-based ones, you're left with a series of others. And it's interesting to me, if I then take away the ones based in London with British founders, I'm left with the bulk. Roughly 14 of the investments I've made are based in London, but with non-British founders. That's the legacy. That's what I think would have been inspiring at the Great Exhibition. So the next thing that I think is incredibly equivalent today that we would have seen at the Great Exhibition is the explosion of tools that actually harness our own creativity. The Industrial Revolution gifted us the building blocks to create new, better stuff. If you'd gone there, you would have seen a full-scale locomotive. You would have seen condensed milk for the first time. You would have seen early versions of bicycles. This stuff became the building blocks for subsequent creativity. And And I think we're seeing something similar. You know, a specific example that inspired me, you can see, can't quite read it, but it's actually the Illustrated London News press. They actually displayed their press, and we know that part of Tech City's legacy is actually exactly this, the printing industry, the creative services that supported the printing industry. So this was the Illustrated London News, and this was the machine, the first machine ever that could produce 5,000 copies of something an hour. It must have been incredible to see that going, and that building block gave us the potential, gave Londoners the potential to market for the first time, to scale marketing. These building blocks are unbelievably important, and we sit here today, I think, with, you know, well, without a shadow of doubt, with the best tools, the best building blocks to actually, in a low friction way, create now. So we are sat here when there's over, you know, 1 billion smartphones in use on the planet. There's more smartphones registered per day than there are kids born globally. Each one is a supercomputer. There's expected by 2020 to be 50 billion connected devices. This is what Rohan was talking about that we're addressing. We're all leaving a sort of data exhaust, and making sense of all of that noise is hugely challenging, but will create huge value. Now, one of the things I have a continuous run-in with people about, and I'm about to shoot myself in the foot on this, is a lot of people say to me, oh, well, we'll just use it for doing things like smashing Angry Birds against pigs. We're not going to harness these tools for good stuff. And someone sent me yesterday this video called Masters of the Universe very appropriately, which we'll just play very quietly in the background because it's so ridiculous. And actually the URL of this is heyyayayay.com. It's had 25 million views. The good news with this sort of stuff is people are just doing it for fun, building the skills. If we see people creating ridiculous websites like this, it's not necessarily a bad thing. They're building muscles. And then we can apply that strength to do new, more important stuff. The most inspiring example I saw recently, many of you know the one laptop per child. The idea that actually everyone in the developing world deserves a laptop to learn from. They ran an experiment actually where they took Motorola Zoom tablets and they dropped them into, not literally, but they put them in villages in Ethiopia and they left the kids alone with them with zero training, absolutely no training. And they found within 4 minutes, one of the kids, illiterate kids, never even heard of electricity, had undone the box and they found the power switch. So that was pretty amazing. What was more amazing is 5 days later, the kids were using on average 47 apps per day each. So their learning was accelerated in a way that probably traditional sort of training would have slowed them down. It would have slowed down the smartest of these kids. And then in 2 weeks, they were actually singing ABC songs around the village in English, having never known actually what English was. And then most amazingly, 5 months later, one of them had hacked the operating system, the Android operating system, and they'd enabled the camera that the guys at one laptop per child had disabled because they thought it'd be too much of a distraction. So they were wandering around taking photos. So these tools, these building blocks, this access will be unbelievably creative. It's a building block, a foundation. And there's other tools like the credit card-sized Linux-powered Raspberry Pi, which is a UK success story. So these guys have actually sold 500,000 units already. They're about 22 quid, I think, each. It's an amazing bit of kit. This has more processing power than a 747 or something. It's an incredibly useful tool, another building block. And we start to see people in London taking these tools and combining them. And the sum is greater than the sum of the parts. So an example would be Kickstarter, another, I think, Tech City success, Kickstarter coming to the UK. And one of the first projects that got funded combined the Raspberry Pi with Kickstarter funding and created a sort of arcade game system that people have been buying. And it's already, I took this video a week ago, but you can see they doubled their funding target. They got they wanted £30,000 and they got 60,000 committed then. And everything that we're talking about here the sort of digital benefits is also true of the physical. So you'll hear examples today of 3D printing, additive manufacture, where we can mass customize almost anything. So for me, these building blocks, coupled with this diversity, which is what we saw in the Great Exhibition, will create an explosion of creativity or craft. And so the final point I wanted to share with you, just a quick one, I think is a good story of craft and a good representation of this diversity coming together with building blocks to come up with a new perspective, is the story of the building itself in the Great Exhibition. So it was actually built or designed by a guy called Joseph Paxton, who at 15, he was completely unqualified, and at 15 he became a garden boy. At 20 years old, he was head gardener at Chatsworth, and he started designing these lily ponds and started designing greenhouses. Now, I guess it would have been 1850, Prince Albert had challenged himself to come up with a great design for the building, and he put up a global competition for it. They got 245 designs, and only 2 seemed vaguely appropriate. The problem was, both were too complex. They were ridiculously difficult to build. So in a last-ditch attempt to solve the problem, in came Paxton, and he suggested this design for the Crystal Palace, which we all know. And this was basically the first prefabricated building of its time. This was a function of his diversity, him coming from a completely different direction than traditional architects, coupled with building blocks, the tools, low-cost steel, low-cost glass. In fact, the glass tax had disappeared, so it was viable to do this for the first time. And he combined those two things, and he's created this structure which was kind of one of the great wonders at the time, and they rebuilt in South London, hence Crystal Palace, that name sticking. He built this in 8 months with 2,000 people, and it cost £80,000 at the time. And it became the platform for the Great Exhibition. It was one of the wonders itself. And I think we see this combination of, a desire to actually a diverse background coupled with the building blocks are inspiring people in London, in the UK, globally to make stuff. If you do a Google trend analysis just on the term make, then you see this rise, probably sort of correlating, you can't see the numbers, forgive me for that, but roughly in about 2010, maybe linked to the financial crisis, it started flying up again. People want to make. And I won't steal their thunder, but later today you're going to hear amazing examples of this. People with diverse experiences, taking the building blocks that we see from digital, but also particularly additive manufacturing and 3D printing, and creating completely novel and new things. So instead of sort of leaving you with specific examples there, I wanted to challenge us with a question actually. And my question would be, next year is a big year for the UK again. How would we run a great exhibition in London next year? What would it need to look like? How would we touch a third of the UK population to inspire them as to what might be? How might we show them role models that don't come from traditional narrow sectors, but instead combine the skills that should all fall under the umbrella of creativity, whether it be architecture, mechanical engineering, biology, it's all creativity. Thank you very much for your time.